What's up, and welcome to the Level Health Podcast. Today, Josh is interviewing Luke Tulloch. Luke is a personal trainer and podcaster with a focus on breaking down evidence-based fitness in a way that's easy to understand. He's been working with clients since 2008, and like many other professionals we have talked to, his approach has changed quite a bit over the course of his career. For those of you that know Luke, you know he has a wealth of information to share, and this episode is no exception. Big thanks to Luke for coming on our show. You can follow him on Instagram at _Luke Tulloch or check out the Luke Tulloch podcast. We'll have both of those links in the description. For those of you that don't already know, our website, Level Health, is a directory, community, and network of qualified personal trainers. We want to help create a space where clients are able to find the right trainer for them. We have accounts for both clients and fitness professionals. Client accounts are always free, where you'll get access to our trainer directory and all of our resources. Our basic pro option is now available for trainers, and our verified pro membership will be available early this year. We also have a brand new free membership option for personal trainers that want access to our growing list of discounts and resources. If you haven't signed up already, head over to levelhealth.net and set up your membership. We have lots of new discounts and resources available, so definitely go check those out. Thanks for listening, and if you have a second, we would love it if you gave us a rating and review so that our podcast and the professionals we interview can get more exposure. You can also subscribe so you don't miss any of our new content. Thanks, and we hope you enjoy the episode.
I wanted to have you on the podcast for a while, man, because really like the intellectual stance or position that you take with science and, exercise science, nutrition, everything. It's really something that I aligned with very quickly. And it's something that I'm sure you're aware lets people trust you and your resources pretty dang quickly, because we're never going to be right about everything. I think that's something that you learn when you're going into science, and you kind of just, it's baked into the equation. But when we're trying to apply it, I think that's when our ideologies get mixed in, our egos definitely get mixed in. So I just want to let you know that, man, you were definitely one of the few resources, one of the few accounts on social media that I wholeheartedly recommend to people.
Oh, thanks heaps, dude. Yeah, you know what? It's one of those funny things, because I think when obviously the science is super helpful and it's like really important, but ultimately the people interpreting it and like the lens that it ends up traveling through before we get to use it is still a person full of like cognitive biases, like you said, and all that sort of stuff. So it's important to kind of keep all of that in mind and kind of recognize like, hey, I'm going to have my own little echo chamber that I'm in. There's going to be a lot of stuff in here that's probably going to get kind of mixed up and then spat out a little bit different. So yeah, that sort of sciencey aspect is really important, but I think also, like you said, just recognizing that there are some limitations to both the science and also how we interpret it. And that's really where the rubber hits the road, is how we actually use it in real life. And that's something that I just try and keep at the front of my mind a lot. Because I think earlier in my career, I was super into the science, which is great, but I probably didn't pay attention to the practical application of it as much as I should have. So yeah.
Yeah, we start learning some stuff and we think that that's like all there is. But I think there seems to be an inevitable point in which we realize, okay, it's actually more about the application than the actual X's and O's. So, but you said interpret multiple times, and I think that was important to state, because a lot of times I think we tend to see the other side of that, and we think that people are being malicious in it. But in reality, you really can interpret science. I mean, like you said, all of your cognitive biases, all of your past experience and everything, and influences how you're going to interpret it. So like two people could look at the same exact study and find two different things from it. And it's like, the important thing is that you accept that that's a possibility, and that other people may have different interpretations, and yours may not be absolutely correct. But so I wanted to ask you one thing that's kind of related. Actually, this is probably the most appropriate time to ask it. You are a self-proclaimed coffee snob. How do you feel about kind of the weight of the research seeming to shift towards coffee being actually pretty dang good for you?
Yeah, I mean, that's a nice little side effect. I think I would drink it anyway, to be honest. So I'm not sure it's really changed my mind too much, but yeah, that's definitely a nice thing for sure. And I mean, like a lot of people drink it and enjoy it, of course. And it is one of those funny things where I think a lot of the research is like, 4 cups a day or 5 cups a day or something. I'm like, holy crap. Like, I drink coffee daily, but I'm not doing more than 2 or 3 cups a day. I
Yeah.
think by the time we're getting to like I started drinking coffee at 7 a.m. and I'm still going at 6 p.m. That's probably getting towards the end where we're not getting the benefits so much anymore.
Getting some diminishing returns there for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's funny because I mean, there's obviously a wide spectrum though when it comes to coffee too. So it's not even like you're going to get Maxwell House or Folgers and it's going to give you potentially any of the same benefits in terms of like free radicals, scavenging and stuff like
Yeah,
that.
totally. Well, if anyone out there is like interested, there's actually a dude called James Hoffman who's got a really good YouTube channel. If you like want to kind of get into specialty coffee or something, he's super approachable. Knows his shit, like really knows his stuff. But it's one of those where he's just like an interesting guy. He's interested in making things practical and usable. And I originally came across him because he actually has a really good book called like the Atlas of Coffee or something like that. But then he started this YouTube channel and it's just exploded. Like the last 2 years, he's gained like 2 million followers or something like that. So, but that's really good. So if you want to get into it, like that's a good place to start. And I suppose I would imagine, I haven't seen any data on this, but I would imagine, like you said, if you're buying like pre-ground, stale, store-bought kind of stuff, it's probably going to be pretty different to, grinding it fresh yourself and all that sort of thing. So
Yeah. Okay. We'll move on now. But the one secret is definitely grind your own coffee beans for sure. For sure. Not even being a snob here. I do it. I just make cold brews. So it's like the least effort. But anyway, so the way that I typically start out the shows, I mean, we've been talking for a little bit here, but I think that this part is definitely important because you have I want to say a weird background. You have a unique background. You have a unique a job currently, like the way that you work with people through fitness. So I wanted to hear you just give us a little background on who you are and why you do what you do.
Yeah, man, totally. Well, I'm originally actually, I was born in South Africa, but I grew up in Australia. So my hometown is Sydney in Australia, and I started coaching people there in 2008. So this will be, like 14 years or something. And partway through, I went to university and studied some neuroscience, which I don't really use aside from just kind of understanding some basic biology and that sort of stuff, which definitely helps when you're looking at research and that sort of thing. But otherwise, it was mostly just like in the trenches, man. It was a lot of coaching in big box gyms. So we have Fitness First in Australia, which is around the world, but I think it's mostly like UK and maybe in Singapore and stuff like that. And then from there, went into an independent gym for a while. That was sort of in inner city in Sydney, and there were a lot of really good coaches there. It was a really great place to coach people, but eventually just decided to transition to online and do a little bit of traveling, do some seminars, that kind of stuff. And as soon as I did that, two things happened. Firstly, the gym that I worked at closed, but I had my plans to leave anyway. And then the second thing was as soon as we got overseas into Europe, I did my first seminar in Stockholm, and then all the borders started closing because of COVID. So we kind of just ended up staying in Europe. But long story short, I coach people online now. So that's my main thing that I do. Like in between, I've kind of put out some courses and stuff for personal trainers, but that's the main thing. I just coach people online full time, which is really great because it's flexible and I can work with anyone, but it also has its challenges because I think probably some of the stuff we're going to talk about is like, how you communicate with people is much more challenging when you're not seeing them face to face often and you can't sort of have a real-time conversation with them and that sort of stuff. So that's kind of where I'm at, man. And in between, like most of my stuff goes out on Instagram. And again, that's trying to translate stuff into a medium that is not conducive to long form, so that's also
not only is it not conducive, I mean, your page is doing very well, obviously, but it seems like it's almost designed against long form, trying to put a lot of caveats and a lot of information, and like people just, I don't know what percentage of people actually read the captions, which is where you have to actually put a lot of information. But I mean, the like I said, right when we got started, like the stance that you take, the position that you take, one of my favorite posts, I think you did a series of them about what you were wrong on. And like I felt that like that was just absolutely so important. So your bio on Instagram says making fitness science easy to use. What about fitness science is difficult to use?
Yeah, it's a tough one, because fitness science is frankly not that robust compared to some other areas of science. Like if you were a physicist and you came into what we do in fitness science, you would be disgusted at how experiments are run and stuff, right? So I guess the problem is that there's just a lot of dynamic variables that we have to try and account for in a person's life. Like biology is really complex, and the way you interact with your environment in the world is complex. And you can't account for all of that in a study. And even if you could, it's difficult to design studies to take all of that into account and to recruit all the participants and all that sort of stuff. So really what we're trying to do with fitness science is we're trying to sort of answer quite specific questions like piece by piece. And what ends up happening is like eventually you start gathering evidence and it reveals more and more and more of the picture. And you kind of got to thread that in with what you see happening in the real world and try not to get your cognitive biases in the way too much to get a good outcome, right? So I sort of don't really see it as like the fitness science is just going to straight up come out with a study that's going to give you an answer to an important question. That happens pretty rarely. Instead, it's just going to give you a little bit of insight that you can maybe then piece together with all of the other stuff that you've seen before. And I suppose that's the challenge, is like that's quite inaccessible, because it means that the average person firstly has to have the skills to read and interpret these studies. But secondly, they've got to keep on top of it. Like it's hard work to stay on top of all of these studies being done and to kind of piece it all together and to understand, oh, but this says this and this says that, so what's the truth? And so I just wanted to make that like easy to use the science, not to just ignore it and go, oh, it's too hard, but to be able to actually apply some of it while still understanding like, hey, this is not going to give us all the answers, and we do need to do a little bit of, personal experience and look at what other experts are saying and all this sort of stuff. So yeah, I mean, sometimes that does mean that we get a piece of data that we go, oh wow, I wasn't really expecting that, and it maybe changes how we think about things. So like a good example of that is when we're talking about muscle growth, there was a study that came out a few years ago that showed that if we use very light loads or sort of more moderate loads, we can get the same amount of muscle growth provided we train to failure. And for a lot of people in this space, it was just like, just blew minds, because we used to think like, hey, you got to train heavy to grow muscle. Like it kind of makes sense intuitively. But when that study came out, it kind of showed us that actually now it's opened up the door for a lot of other research and a ton of variety in how we set up other experiments, because now we have the option of kind of separating rep ranges out. Yeah. We have the option of programming in a bunch of different ways, and we know that part of the mechanism involved there is just the fact that as you approach failure, you start to recruit more and more and more muscle fibers and place tension on them, and that tension is actually what causes this chemical cascade inside the muscle fiber to make it grow. So that was like a really key finding that I think was a little bit counterintuitive to what a lot of people probably believed and what the received wisdom was, but it ended up being pretty fundamental to how we think about things.
Man, there's a lot there. I would love to do an entire episode about just like what is the physiological markers that would indicate an effective set, because like effective, man, I don't really want to go too in depth into this, but like effective, the concept of effective sets, I think I heard about it a little bit more in depth from Greg Nuckols. I think people were talking about it before then, but using that as a concept to modulate volume can be an incredibly practical tool. And I've used it a ton, like you're mentioning, like there's slightly different physiological effects from like a lower rep set, obviously, and then a higher rep set, and then a little bit more as you get higher up. But it's kind of just like big, vague windows that they mesh over each other. So like just understanding that, and like then how can you use that to then make your life in the gym, because it's not your number one thing. Let's use these scientific principles to make our lives easier in the gym. So we're not trying to be the most jacked person in the world, although these principles still apply. But let's use these to make our lives easier. And like right now I'm going to school and finishing my biology degree, and like we just like every like intro class, I mean, I'm far past intros now, but like the very basics of every class is like, this is the scientific mindset. Let's assume that we're wrong and try to like get a little bit less wrong over time. And I think like that absolutely that mindset absolutely can be applied to applying these principles with people in the context of personal training. Like it's like you said, there's a lot of dynamic variables. There's a lot that goes into it. But if we just assume that we're not going to be right away, we're not going to be right at first, like that's so much of a better spot than, I mean, being this incredibly prescriptive coach or trainer that's saying this is what we need to do. Because then when, you know, it comes down to why am I not getting results, and it's almost like in a personal offense to you, because you've got your ego so wrapped up into it. So I don't know if you can tell, I'm speaking from personal experience. Like I'm just thinking about my background, like how I've worked with clients way back in the day. And it's like, man, I'm just trying to rectify a lot of these problems that I contributed to in the industry for sure.
Yeah, totally. No, I mean, I love the way you phrase that, where like we kind of know we're wrong. We're just trying to be less wrong. And, you know, for me, that's definitely what we're trying to do. Like there's tons of ways to program. There's tons of things that work. And so from a practical perspective, we're not trying to look at science and go, what's right necessarily, because a single study, like I mentioned, is not going to tell you like, this is the training protocol that you've got to use with your client. Really what you're trying to do is be like, all right, cool. Well, this is what seems to be a better direction than maybe another direction. And so that narrows down my sort of potential options a little bit. But within that, there's a lot of flexibility that you can use to make sure that, you know, a workout is enjoyable for the client or practical in whatever gym they have with the equipment that they have and things like that. So that's a better mindset to come at it with, rather than trying to look at the science to be like, you know, which study tells me what the perfect split is or the perfect exercise to do is, right?
Yeah, there's not a single study. There's not even a single meta-analysis. Like there's not even, there's almost no single source that we can pretty safely say there's no single source that we should exclusively rely on to make any decisions. And you just kind of have to like, I kind of look at it like steering a boat. Like I'm not, either whether I'm reading a book, whether I'm taking a course, something like that, like I'm not trying to absorb every single little bit of information because it's not necessarily practical. I'm gonna pull what I need and pull what I can use. I used to say that tell clients with that if they'd want to try some kind of like pretty specific diet, like they want to do keto, like, all right, well, let's do that. Let's, you know, see how you respond to it, take what works from that and pull it out, because you're probably going to lose weight really quickly. You're good, you know, and, you know, you explain the reasons why for that and everything. But like we can pull bits and pieces from all these different approaches and methodologies, and then just make something that's kind of like uniquely our own.
Yeah, definitely. I view it all as just like, they're all tools, right? And so the idea is just when and how do I apply those tools for my situation? And in that sense, there's nothing that, well, there's some stuff that's like probably pretty egregious and not correct, right? But there's a lot of stuff where there is a context or a situation where it would be pretty useful. And I guess that's what makes it difficult, you know, when we were just talking about like Instagram before, and it doesn't allow for a lot of nuance. So you'll just get some question of like thoughts on keto. And it's like, dude, where the hell do I start with that? Like, okay, in one situation, it could be the best thing that ever happened to someone. And in another, it could be the worst, like, and everything in between. So the idea really is just like, let's learn about this stuff, but more importantly, let's figure out where it can be applied and how. And that might mean that sometimes the same person is going to use a calorie counting approach or an intuitive eating approach or a keto approach or a high carb approach, just depending on how their circumstances change, because guess what? Dynamic variables, right?
Yeah. A little bit of a side note. I like keto because it almost seems like it shoved dietary fats back down people's throats after the 90s when everybody was, I mean, I was born in 91. Like I wasn't even an adult in the 90s, and I was so engrossed in the low fat. Like I thought that all the way through high school, like if you were eating any type of like fat sources, it was just an absolute nightmare for you. You're just gonna get heart disease. It's gonna be a horrible day. But anyway, so on the topic of being less wrong over time, how has your approach to working with clients changed since you started?
I think it's been much more client-centered. Basically, when I first started, I think it was, I mean, it still is kind of important to me, but I work on it a lot. It was really important to me to be the authority and to be right. That was like my main thing, right? And I was still trying to help people, but I think it came from this space of like, well, I've read the research and I have a higher level of knowledge, And it was a little more prescriptive in that sense. And these days, I think it's much more client-centered in the sense that I'm trying to figure out where the client is at right now and meet them there. And then perhaps over time, our approach will evolve and will change. But ultimately, there's a lot, like I said, there's a lot of stuff that can work. And so it's not necessarily about, well, I'm using this approach and this is going to be it forever. And this approach is better than what they were doing before or whatever. It's just about like trying to get something that meets them where they're at. And that's a bit of a tough thing, because a big thing that I'm trying to get across to my clients now is to try and foster a sense of self-efficacy for them. And self-efficacy basically being, I suppose, your confidence in yourself to overcome challenges. And that means that sometimes you have to be a little bit hands-off. So in the past, where I try and get in as a coach and try and tinker with everything and give a solution to everything, I think that now it's more a case of trying to guide the client and provide some tools where possible, but at the same time being able to kind of step back and let them figure some stuff out with your support still there in the background. That's really challenging to do, especially when someone, comes to you as a coach and they think, okay, this guy's got experience, he's got knowledge, I'm going to like dig into my savings to like work with this person. And then I might be like a little hands off with them so that they can find their own way a little bit, right? So it's a challenge trying to find that balance. But I think that ultimately what it means is that they end up learning a whole lot more, and it improves their life over a longer period of time, rather than just like, cool, our 12 weeks is up, see ya, and then they leave. And then it's like, what do I do? Because this guy was kind of just writing down a detailed plan and had a prescription for every little thing in my life. And now he's gone. Now what do I do? So that's the main sort of change in mindset that I've had.
Oh, man. Yeah. So I mean, it is difficult to kind of separate yourself from that, and it's almost like you have to prove your worth to people. But like at the end of the day, you have to communicate with the client and say, hey, like, what are we really trying to achieve here? Like, are we trying to, like you said, make you weigh less in 12 weeks, or are we trying to create lasting and sustainable changes that you can continue on the path way long after we're done working? And I mean, this focus on building self-efficacy, can we talk about that just a little bit more? Because like, what are some tools that you use to build it? Just like you can train, I mean, we're talking about pretty much basically like behavior change, which is a lot of neurology, a lot of psychology. What are some tips to actually build that up with? Is it just reps over time? How do you go about that?
Yeah, I think that there's a few ways. So the first thing I think is trying to build the client's ability to kind of observe their own behaviors in the first place. So I think there's a lot of ways you can do that. I mean, there are mindfulness exercises, there are perhaps ways in which you structure check-in questions, the way you do intakes, that kind of stuff, to help them to reflect a little bit more on their own thoughts and emotions and behaviors. Because unless you can sort of observe a behavior or an emotion, it's really difficult to come in and figure out, what was the trigger, what was the context, what was the environment, and then if I want to change it, then I can go in and modify some of that stuff, right? So that's kind of what I'm thinking about. And like I say, the way that you communicate with the client can help them to reflect a little bit better. And then I think it's just asking the right questions as well. If we go to the basic premise of sort of Socratic questioning or motivational interviewing, where you just kind of ask questions without injecting yourself into that too much, then I think the client can often answer problems themselves or clarify how they're feeling or what they want to do or whatever. And then it becomes much easier. So I'll give an example. Like the first thing that I do when I do a client intake is I have what I call a foundation week. And it's basically like client signs up and they get a login to my website that has a little like series of videos and a couple of worksheets. And it's all about, describing behavior change and mindfulness and all this, like habits and all this sort of stuff. And it kind of asks them to go through at one point and figure out some intrinsic values of theirs. An intrinsic value would be something that you feel is really important to you. And ultimately what we want to achieve is to align as many of our behaviors as possible with our intrinsic values. So, for example, someone might say, come to me initially and say, look, I want to build some muscle. Awesome, no problem. But then they go through this process and we kind of go through the intrinsic value thing. And ultimately, it's like, can we reinterpret that extrinsic kind of, I want to be buff, to something that's a little bit more intrinsically valuable to you? And it might be that, like, hey, I just want to feel confident in my body, sort of thing. All right, awesome. Well, now that we have that, it doesn't mean that we abandon this idea of building muscle, but it does give us some other options here. We can help you to feel confident in your body through some other ways. We can get you stronger. We can focus on performance as well. Perhaps we can try some new exercises that you haven't tried before. Perhaps we can do some other physical hobbies outside of the gym. Perhaps we can give you some tools so that you can feel confident in when you're eating out. You can be a bit more flexible and have, like, you know how to do that. So, like, there's lots of different ways that you can then start to align behaviors with intrinsic values. And so that really promotes a sense of self-efficacy. So that's quite different to, like, well, I grew muscle just because, like, I wanted to raise my social status kind of thing by looking buffer, so people, like, look at me and go, wow. That's fine. Like, it's fine to have that. But unless you also have behavior that is aligned with your intrinsic values, I don't think you're going to get that same sense of self-efficacy, because you don't end up building that sort of confidence in what you're capable of, and that something is coming from you, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I found this particularly important during weight loss, because as we all know, weight loss is not going to occur every week. And if you are setting up these goalposts where you're essentially setting up your kind of like primate brain to think that you are losing until you hit this goal, which is, potentially months and months and months down the road. And now every little day that you don't lose weight, you're picking up an L, and it's just compounding and degrading that self-efficacy. So what little you may have at that point. So that's absolutely like, if you set up these, like you said, what is actually behind this? What value is behind this? If you want to lose weight so that you are able to, lower your blood pressure on your next checkup, so that whatever. So you're getting markers that your health is improving. Like, those are that can happen from other things besides weight loss. Let's start lifting weights, and that's going to have potentially a similar effect almost without any weight loss potentially. So, like, there's all types of ways that we can achieve these, but if we just kind of flippantly say weight loss is the goal, it's like, is it really though? It may be a kind of like a side effect of us making progress toward what your actual goal is. So we can look at it, a completely different way. But like you said, there's a lot that can work. There's a lot of stuff, whether it is weight loss, whether it's building muscle, getting stronger, there's a lot that absolutely can work. So I wanted to ask though, are there any basic principles that kind of just apply to everybody?
Yeah, I think having a principles-based approach is really important. Like, if we go back to, the diet stuff, like, if we just think about, like, a principle of energy balance, this is a really easy way to, like, visualize this. Okay, ultimately, our body composition is going to be predicated on our energy balance. If we're in a deficit, we're going to lose weight. If we're in a surplus, we're going to gain weight. From there, it's like every diet that is successful follows that principle, but it just kind of does it in a different way. Intermittent fasting, well, you're reducing the window in which you eat, so you're kind of reducing your food intake, so maybe that helps you control your weight. Paleo diet, well, you're not eating hyperpalatable foods, reduces the amount you eat, and therefore you lose weight. Keto, etc. So that sort of fundamental principle helps you to not be too dogmatic about the specific details of what you're doing. And it allows you to kind of have this whole host of tools. If I understand that principle of energy balance, now I have 20, 30 different approaches that I can use. Whereas if I'm like keto guy or paleo guy and this is the only way, like, what happens if it doesn't work? What happens if you kind of fall off the wagon? Like, there's no flexibility in there. So I do think there are some principles that are really important, but I also think that we don't want to make them too complicated. That idea of energy balance is nice and simple. It's digestible. It's applicable to a bunch of different things. I mean, the same thing with the weight training, where we talked about getting within range of failure on a set being kind of like the main thing that's going to drive hypertrophy. Great. Well, there's lots of different ways we can set that up now. Like, tons of different things we can use, but it has to be pretty clear and actionable that way. So that's kind of the main thing. But if more broadly, I do think that like that idea of trying to align whatever you're doing with some kind of intrinsic value is also a fundamental principle, because that helps to guide you as to whether what you're doing is actually correct for you at the moment or not. And so that's really big, because your values could shift and change over time as well. And then it helps you to just kind of figure out like, hey, is the way that I've set up my diet at the moment, or the way that I've set up my training at the moment, actually aligning with, how I want to live and what I'm really working towards here. And then so like that kind of has a principles approach, because it means that it kind of isn't too focused on the details. It's more focused on like the big picture of where the ship's pointed, so to speak.
Yeah, it's always, and then it's also, like we were talking about a little bit earlier, incredibly important to have a principles-based approach if you have other things going on in life. Like I've recently, so I haven't been in a gym for almost 10 months now. And that was the biggest shift I've ever experienced, because I've been in a gym every single available day since I was like 12 years old. And I thought that that's where fitness, later on down the road, I knew that this was incorrect, but there was such a social component tied to it. It's such a habitual component tied to it. But I used to think that fitness had to happen at a gym. And now I've been training in my garage. We've got a squat rack and maybe like 300 pounds of weights. Like I've been good for the last 10 months, but it's because I've been applying these principles to my training, to my nutrition, to my recovery, everything like that, because you need to have these things to fall back on. And that same thing applies for, like I said, if your goal is weight loss, if your goal is to build muscle. So there really is, as much as we like hate speaking, I'm sure you do as well, speaking in hyperbole, like there are some really basic things that apply pretty much to everybody. And really, I think that it clearly comes down to the fact that we're biological mechanisms with similar underpinning physiology and like general structure and function. And so that we can go off of that really to start out with.
Yeah, actually, it's as you were sort of saying that stuff, I was also thinking the same thing. Yeah, the underlying physiology is pretty much the same between everybody. And so these principles do work. And it's like this sort of dichotomy, this battle between like, yes, there are some things that need to be individualized, but there's also this sort of underlying physiology. You know what I mean? Like a calorie deficit's going to work for you no matter who you are. But the way we achieve that calorie deficit is going to be super different between people potentially. So there's that balance there, right? And it's like, that's where it comes back to trying to have a more sort of client-centered approach, where you're trying to figure out what are the constraints I have here to apply these principles. So it's super interesting. That's what makes the job interesting.
Yeah, it does. The kind of client-centered approach, I think, seems to be the way that the industry is shifting, but it seems to be happening individual by individual at a time. And so like in the same way that we get echo chambers for potentially negative things like on social media, I think that we potentially are in kind of do you go out searching for stuff outside of this echo chamber? Because I'm sure that you are. Do people send you like nonsense that's occurring? Because we tend to have to like go out and look for it. Because I'll be I've been doing podcasts and talking to people like yourself, and it's like, man, it seems like everybody's good. Like I don't know where are these problems at? But then I remember that there's the whole other side of the industry. So we go out searching. Do people like send you stuff?
Oh yeah. I mean, look, I got to be perfectly honest. On social media, stuff like that, I actually don't engage with any fitness content whatsoever. I make a big point of having tons of interests outside of fitness, because I actually think that promotes self-efficacy, because you have a richer sort of tapestry of experiences to draw on and a better concept of like what the world's like out there. But I think you're 100% right. It's so easy to create an echo chamber and a little cocoon for yourself. And if you're only following quote unquote evidence-based professionals, you would think, oh yeah, sweet, everything's in the right direction. Everybody kind of knows what they're doing. Like everyone out there's tracking, blah, blah, blah. And the reality is it's not. Like I always remember, I can't remember who it was. I think it might've been like Alan Aragon or something, was kind of like, all the stuff that we're doing is great in this sort of evidence-based community, but no, it was Lyle McDonald. And he was like, but the reality is like, all of the evidence-based professionals put together probably get like 1% of the clicks that some big fitness celebrity is getting, right? And so whenever I talk to a person, it's quite interesting in like, because I'm living in Sweden now, I'm really trying to get out there and make more social connections and that sort of stuff. And every time I tell them what my job is, like, no one knows what the fuck I actually do. They're like, what? So you sit on Zoom and like you tell people what to do and check their form and stuff? I'm like, nah, dude, it's not how it works at all. And it's quite difficult for them to wrap their heads around like what online coaching actually looks like from my perspective. Whereas in my little world, you know, I know tons of online coaches that do the same thing that I do. And all the clients who come to me pretty much have a basic expectation of how it works. But the reality is that that's like 1% of 1% of the totality of people out there trying to get a workout in, you know? So yeah, you're totally right. But I actually try not to pay too much attention to what's going on out there. I don't know. I think it would maybe just drive me a little bit crazy.
Yeah, I was going to say it's probably good for your mental health. I mean, the fitness industry is evolving, and a lot of people are trying to kind of nudge it in the right direction. And I think that's a huge part of what we're trying to do is just kind of, I mean, if we're going in a direction, we've got some momentum. Let's see if we can help steer it in a positive direction, because a lot of the influences really are, I hate to use this kind of dad joke, but influencers, like the people on, like you said, the 99% of clicks that are going towards these celebrities, they're not making even necessarily helpful recommendations or selling helpful products or services. So hopefully we can kind of nudge things in the right direction. But with your long background in PT, I mean, you started 2008.
Yeah.
I started high school in 2007, so that'll tell you something. But
there we go.
so you have like a long history in this. How do you feel that the personal training industry can improve overall?
Yeah, you know, I think just kind of exposing yourself to more information and being a little more open-minded and being aware of some of those cognitive biases is probably the first step, right? Ultimately, I don't really mind that people have some different opinions on things to me. Like I don't need everyone to kind of be on the same page as your standard like evidence-based practitioner reading research or whatever. What I think is important is that there are people out there who are willing to kind of challenge their own beliefs and their own ideas and seek out contrary information and just kind of put a little bit of effort into paying attention to their own cognitive biases and doing their due diligence in terms of just analyzing stuff a little bit logically and kind of being like, hey, maybe this does work, or maybe this doesn't make sense what I've been doing all this time. It's difficult to do, but I've been there, trust me. Like, I mean, you mentioned those posts before that I made where I mentioned some of the stuff I got wrong, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. But I think that's really how we move forward, because I'm sure a lot of the stuff that I'm saying today, I'm going to have to go through that process and change my tune on as well, or at least refine it, right? And it's going to be key that I keep that mindset that I've just sort of described.
Yeah, I mean, we need people to disagree in general to keep conversations going. But I think that a helpful mindset is to just consider, what if you're actually wrong? Like, what if you don't know anything? And then, if it helps, maybe look back. And I mean, this is something I don't know how healthy it is, but look back at the times when you had this hard mindset on something and you were embarrassingly wrong. And just remember that. Just keep that one, like, I don't know, write it down somewhere so you remember those times, because like it's potentially happening right now. And that's not to say that you can't have strong opinions on things, because like we've talked about, there are some basic principles that apply. And I mean, the one thing that I'm so nervous about is resistance training, because it seems like all of the research coming out, it's too good to be true. Like the benefits from resistance training shouldn't be what they are. They shouldn't be as helpful as they are. They should, and then also creatine, like the research coming out on creatine potentially being like almost an essential supplement. Obviously not going to say that, but like it might benefit a lot of people in a lot of ways. So like those are the two that I'm like, oh man, I'm ready to jump on board, but I've learned from my mistakes. Let's hedge our bets here. Let's make sure that we're not, being too dogmatic about our ideas, and kind of just adapt and have an iterative mindset.
Yeah, totally. I think one of the helpful things to do is, like, if you have some kind of idea or a recommendation that you're giving to people, to kind of think about it like, or someone that, if you're debating with them, it's like, what's the best argument or two or three in favor of this recommendation, and what's the best argument or two or three against this? And going through that process, just kind of, most of the time you're going to land somewhere in the middle there, right? But it just helps you kind of temper it and be like, yeah, potentially, creatine's going to has all these cognitive benefits and blah 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 blah. On the other hand, like these are the arguments against it. Like we've seen time and time again, so many supplements fall flat, and ultimately, in the bigger picture, there's just not that much that supplements can do. That like lifestyle and stuff doesn't do 100 times better, and all this stuff. And so you end up kind of being somewhere in between. But at least you've kind of taken the time to actually examine the best arguments on both sides of the fence.
I've been burned too many times. I mean, I'm sure you're at this point too, where you're spending a sizable percentage of your monthly income on supplements.
Oh,
and
yeah.
So, I mean, I was burned way too many times, and then creatine came along, and it's like, oh yeah, it's $5 for a tub. Like, yeah, it's not, no, it's not helping anybody. But in reality, that's why it was $5, because it was just such a staple molecule almost. So, anyways, Luke, this was awesome, man. I appreciate you coming on. I think most of our listeners are personal trainers or coaches in the fitness space. So if they're not already listening to you, already checking out your content, I'm sure they will be now. And we appreciate what you're doing for the industry, man.
Oh, thanks a ton, man. I appreciate it. Good to chat.